Well, hello, adult Sunday school leader. Last week we had that special focus lesson on the sanctity of human life, but this week we're back in the unit that's called Owning a Faith That Matters. This is the second lesson called Yielded Faith. The focal passage is Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, and the point of this lesson is faith acknowledges the authority of Jesus. Well, if you've been in church for a while, you're probably familiar with this story. It's about a servant of a Roman soldier who was healed just by Jesus speaking a word. Now, there are three different ways we can approach this story. We can look at the viewpoint of Jesus, we can go with the viewpoint of the healed man, or the viewpoint of the soldier. Well, in this lesson, we'll be looking at the faith of that soldier and how that faith caused Jesus to be amazed, to marvel. Well, let's look first at that first set of scriptures in Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. And we see that our story takes place in Capernaum. Well, let's look at this map of Israel. There's the Sea of Galilee in the north. Now, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago in the Luke 5 lesson. The Dead Sea in the south and the Jordan River that runs between the two. Well, I'm going to stop right here for a minute and just give a little teaching tip. Okay, whenever I can, I try to find ways to tie a previous week's lesson in with the current one. It's a way of review and just another way for your students to make that connection between lessons from week to week. So 2 weeks ago, in the first lesson of this unit, I mentioned that the Sea of Galilee also had two other names. So I'm going to ask my class if they can recall those two names. And by the way, in case you forgot, those answers are Lake Gennesaret and the Sea of Tiberias. All those describe the same body of water. Now, let's go back to the maps and let's zoom in a little bit, and we can see that Capernaum is on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, Capernaum was the hub of Jesus' ministry in Galilee. Matthew 4:13 states that Jesus lived in Capernaum. And also Jesus performed many miracles there, including the healing of a paralytic that was lowered through the roof by his friends. There was the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. There was the healing of the woman with the issue of blood. And the raising of Jairus' daughter, just to name a few. And by the way, Jairus' daughter raising, that's in the next week's lesson. Well, it was in this hometown of Capernaum that a centurion lived. He was in command of 100 men, but he only had command of 80 soldiers. What does that mean? Well, let's look at the basic structure of the Roman army. A soldier was called a legionnaire. 8 legionnaires composed a contubernium, which what we would call a squad. Now, 10 of these contuberniums, that's a hard word to say, made up a century. Now, there's a word we know, right? It means 100. 6 centuries made up a cohort, and 10 cohorts made up a legion. And that's a name you might be familiar with. In Mark chapter 5, verse 9, Jesus addressed the unclean spirit in the possessed man, and he asked the spirit's name. And the spirit replied, "Call me Legion, for we are many." Well, you've probably heard sermons on that passage about the demon-possessed man that explained that a legion was 6,000 men. Well, let's look at some numbers, okay? 8 legionnaires made up a contubernium, and 10 of those made up a century, which comes to 80, okay? What's that about? And if we work the math on up the ladder, we see that a legion was composed of 4,800 soldiers. So where did the 6,000 number come from for a legion, and why does a century only have 80? Well, let's look at the next slide, okay? A contubernium was composed of 8 soldiers and 2 slaves. So there were 8 soldiers, but 10 men in that group. And as you work the math up the hierarchy, you'll see that a century had 80 soldiers, but 100 men, 20 slaves attached to that century. And a legion was indeed composed of 6,000 men. Well, when we think of a Roman soldier, our minds, at least my mind, often goes to the Easter story of the way these men took pleasure in implementing as much suffering as possible on the tortured person to be executed. We think of the Romans' hatred of their Jewish subjects, which, by the way, that feeling was mutual. But there was something different about this centurion. Now, what do we notice that's different? I see his relationship with his servant. That was different. He really cared for him. His relationship with the Jewish people, and particularly Jesus. And this wasn't the norm. In a day when servants were treated as property, the centurion servant was valued highly by his boss, if not his master. We're not sure what the relationship there is of those two guys. Another unusual characteristic of this Roman soldier was that he had a good relationship with the Jewish people. Verse 5 tells us that he loved Israel and was even responsible for building the local synagogue. His rapport was such that he asked the Jewish elders to approach Jesus with his request, and they complied, which was also odd because Jewish leaders weren't all that fond of the Romans, particularly Roman soldiers. Well, verse 4 said that these leaders pleaded with Jesus to come and heal the centurion's servant. And then there's the fact that the centurion asked Jesus, an itinerant Jewish rabbi, to come heal his servant. Verse 3 says that the soldier had heard of Jesus. It doesn't say that he had previously talked with him or seen any of the miracles, but that he had heard of him. Well, in John chapter 4, verses 46 through 54, there's the story of Jesus healing the Roman official's son, which also occurred in Capernaum. Now, this is a similar, but it's a different story. The similarities are that they both involved Roman citizens. There was a household member who was deathly ill, and Jesus healed with just a word. But there are some differences, though, that show that these are different events. In John, the sick person was a son, and the Roman personally begged Jesus to come to his house. In our Luke story this week, the ill person was a servant, and the Roman never faced Jesus personally. Well, let's look on in the next set of verses. That's verses 6 through 8 of Luke 7. So Jesus went with the Jewish leaders, and they were on their way. They were headed toward the house of the centurion. That's when the soldier told his friends to intercept Jesus and convey a message to him. And that's odd, isn't it? If they were going to tell him to stop and no need to come. Because if I wanted somebody to come and heal a loved one, I would want that healer right there at my loved one's bedside, laying on hands and praying or administering medicine, whatever it is, but not this centurion. He didn't consider himself worthy of Jesus even being in his house. He didn't consider himself worthy to be in Jesus' presence, which is why he sent others to both request Jesus heal the servant and to intercept Jesus' coming to the house. Well, this indicates a huge amount of self-awareness and humility on the centurion's part. Just hearing about Jesus and what he was doing allowed the soldier to see himself in the light of who Jesus was. Did you notice the term that the centurion told his friends to address Jesus by? It was Lord. This Gentile man who had a command of scores of men under him was able to somehow identify that this Jewish teacher was, at least in the realm of healing, his superior, and addressed him as such, addressed him as Lord, which means master. Remember that the centurion was over 100 men, and he himself had commanders over him. He was well acquainted with authority. He was accustomed to obeying and being obeyed. We bring this into the modern army context. A private would dare not disobey an order from a sergeant, much less a general. Likewise, the centurion had confidence that when he issued an order, it would be carried out. He didn't have to be physically present in order for it to be carried out. The centurion reckoned that Jesus could also just speak the word, and his order would be carried out. Our last set of verses are Luke chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. What was Jesus' reaction? He was what? He was amazed, or he marveled. And why is that? It was because of the faith of the centurion. This army commander did not have the advantage of being raised in a Jewish home, of learning what we now call the Old Testament. He had not even met with Jesus, but he had only heard of him. And this man who had so much faith in the authority of Jesus, he had so much faith that he knew that Jesus didn't have to be at his servant's bedside in order to heal him. He could just speak the word and it would be done. Now, Let's compare that time to the only other time in Scripture that states that Jesus was amazed. It's recorded in Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. And in this passage, Jesus taught in the synagogue in his hometown. Many heard him, and they were amazed at his teaching. But among themselves they asked, isn't this that carpenter? Isn't this Joseph and Mary's son? And what about these miracles he's performing? What's up with that? And then it says, and they took offense at him. They were offended that this hometown boy, this carpenter, was teaching God's word with authority, and they rejected him. It then says that Jesus was amazed at their lack of faith. In our story this week, Jesus marveled at the faith of a Gentile who had never met him. In the Mark chapter 6 story, Jesus was amazed at the lack of faith of the Jewish people who personally knew him. So when referring to the centurion, Jesus said that he had not seen such faith in all of Israel. Now that didn't mean that no Jews believed in him. Of course there were several that did. Many believed. Many were healed by his touch. But it took so much more faith for a Gentile with no Jewish upbringing to believe that Jesus could just speak healing without needing to be physically present. Here are a few parting questions for the week. Think about your own faith. Is Jesus amazed by your faith positively or negatively? What are some of the issues that challenge your faith? And let's remember the point of this lesson, that faith acknowledges the authority of Jesus. Do you truly acknowledge the authority of Jesus, both in your life and over your life? Well, next week we're going to continue in the next chapter in Luke, in chapter 8, as we examine the topic of expectant faith. So thank you guys so much for watching. I do appreciate you. I've been enjoying some of the email correspondence I've had with some of you guys. So thank you so much. Don't forget, pray for and with your class.